Our conversation is about the past and about the South. And so you both are Southerners, at least originally, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about growing up in the South and what it was like, what the dividing lines were like, and how people grappled or didn't with history, this kind of history at that point.
Thank you, Rachel. It's good to be here. I was born in 1941 in Columbus, Georgia. Columbus, Georgia, like all the rest of the South in 1941, and for the entire time that I grew up until I went to college, was deeply in the grips of Jim Crow, what we call Jim Crow, which was a very strict, cruel caste system, a system of segregation. The first middle-class African-American person that I can recall ever laying eyes on was when I was 20 years old, and her name was Charlene Hunter. And she was at the University of Georgia, and I was at the University of Georgia, and I was invited by a sorority sister of mine to go meet Charlene in her dorm on her first week at the University of Georgia. And the Klan was burning crosses all around the outskirts of the campus. And we went to offer to be her bodyguard when she went to class. I was in journalism school, she was in journalism school. And she was dressed exactly the way I was dressed. And I thought, oh my goodness, she's just like me. And it was the first time I had had that experience of an African-American woman just like me. I mean, she's not just like me, she's a lot smarter for one thing. But my sister and I were raised, our mother worked, and we were raised by a black woman named Edna, to whom I dedicated my book. Edna was required to sit in the back seat of the car. Whenever we picked her up or took her home, she was required to go in the back door. When she came to the house, she was required to use the bathroom in the garage. And I never sat next to a black person on a public conveyance. I had very little contact with African Americans. And I was taught very carefully, because I was a difficult child to get through to on what they called racial etiquette. I was taught that all white people are better than any black person. The lowest white person is better than the best black person. This is what I was taught. I never really bought it. I argued, I balked, I broke the rules, I drank out of colored water fountains. I did my little tricks. I insisted that Edna sit up front when I took her home from work, which she wisely refused to do. So that's my part, Ed.
I was born in Savannah, Georgia, and grew up in several places in the South, in Georgia, in South Carolina, in Louisiana, and in Florida. My father was an Episcopal priest. My mother was a secretary. And the reason why we moved around so much was that my father was dissatisfied, I think. And every few years he would request another congregation. And we would pack up and move to another town. Now, those are very different places. The South is not one place, it's many places. New Orleans is quite different from Charleston, South Carolina. Those two cities are very much my hometowns. New Orleans is a laissez-faire, heavy drinking, tolerant city. Charleston, South Carolina is a pas laissez-faire, heavy drinking, intolerant city. But they did have in common, and do have in common, the legacy of Jim Crow. In my childhood, you know, the secret about the dirty secret about Jim Crow is that it worked. This just ambition to separate white people from black people worked. And it was exported from the Deep South around the country. And we have parallel societies which mingle sometimes in the workplace, but on Sunday, of course, never. So my life was, as a child, entirely white, no matter where we lived. And even though this was some decades after your experience with Columbus, what you describe is very familiar to me. And I'll stop there. Rachel.
What did you know growing up about slaveholding in your family? How did people talk about it?
Sure. I knew a good bit about it. My father's family are all in Charleston, South Carolina. My mother's family are all in New Orleans, Louisiana. My father's family were slaveholders for 170 years and controlled some 20 rice plantations on the Cooper River, which drains into Charleston Harbor. And this was the glue of our family identity. Every child in the family, there are about 125 of us in Charleston, received a copy of the memoir written 100 years ago by one of our great aunts, which told the stories of the Ball plantations. And I received this book, and my father was quite nostalgic about these plantations on which he grew up as a child. And in chapter 7 of this memoir, which was called Recollections of the Ball Family of South Carolina, there was a chapter, the only chapter about the black people, was called Plantation, Old Negro Servants, I think it was called. And that was a glimpse, that chapter was a glimpse into the lives of the enslaved people on the Ball plantations. But so I knew quite a lot about a lot comparatively, I suppose, more than many people know about their distant ancestors. But the family lore was largely about the people in the big houses. It was about our great-great-grandfather Isaac the Confederate, who joined the 1st South Carolina Light Artillery and fought through the Civil War. It was about our great-great-uncle William, who went to medical school in Scotland and came back to Charleston and practiced. But there was next to no family lore about the enslaved people, even though the Balls enslaved close to 4,000 people over a period of 170 years. So I began to investigate their story.
Can I ask you, when you started doing that, did you do it with trepidation, or how did you think it was? It's a family story, but you're a journalist, but
Yeah.
families' stories are complicated sometimes. I don't know.
Yeah.
How did people respond to your initial?
Well, yes, I wasn't a young man when I started to investigate this story. I was in my early 30s because there was a taboo around this subject. I was educated after the Civil Rights Movement, and while my parents' generation and before them took great pride and solace in carrying the legacy of a plantation family, for me it was much more complicated. In fact, there was it was like a radioactive story. I was frightened of it. So let's say when I went off to college from the South, I went off to college at Brown University, where most of my, comrades were Northerners. And the way to make friends was not to say, hey, we used to own a lot of slaves. What do you think of that? So it was a kind of dirty secret that I was afraid to approach. I knew that it was important. I knew that our family had something directly to do with the kind of unfolding disaster of race, which generation by generation unfolds in new iterations. And I was afraid to touch it because I thought it might explode. And certainly, to investigate the lives of the enslaved and talk about it publicly was not something that my cousins and uncles and aunts and father would have really wanted me to do.
Karen, I know that you sort of stumbled across this in a conversation with your grandmother, right? But it sounds like there were a lot of taboos as well in kind of delving into this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Most of the taboos, I had been raised with a fear of asking too many questions. I was raised with a fear of asking too many questions. When I asked my mother where we came from, what country my family came from, she said, "Oh, don't be so nosy." She just had an aversion to anything having to do with the past, and now I understand why. But at the time, it seemed rather peculiar to me. I had no idea what I was getting into when I embarked on this story. I knew there were some dangerous things out there, but I also knew that I had to do it.
Why? Why did you feel that?
I had been given orders to do this by a ghost. And I say this as a person that was an investigative journalist for 30 years and doesn't believe in ghosts. And I have friends who said to me all along, if you talk about that ghost, nobody's going to take you seriously. But as it turns out, the ghost is the most popular part of the whole thing. And I discovered what happened was that the ghost was an African-American woman who was dead and was laid out on a slab at the end of my bed on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. in April 1993. And she said to me, without speaking, "Go home, find out what happened." And there had been things happening all along that was leading me in this direction. In fact, as far back as childhood, I knew that I would someday write a book about the South. I had no idea what it was going to be about, but I always had that in my mind. But something kept me from it, so I spent much of my life investigating other people's family secrets and other people's sins against large numbers of people, until finally the day came when I could no longer avoid my true job in this world, which was to go home and find out what happened. At the time, one of the things that was going on in my life was that I had a racially mixed granddaughter that had been born to my son and his African-American girlfriend. And I lived in Minneapolis at the time. My mother and all my relatives were still down in Georgia, and I did not tell them about this beautiful child because they were racist to the core, and I just knew I could write the script of what was going to happen when they found out. So I kept her a secret from my family, and that, of course, ate me up. Psychically, I could not handle that. And so this was probably the main motivating factor that got me back down to Georgia and digging around. I had been told several stories as a child, very brief tidbits of stories. My father told me that the reason he could not stop drinking, he was a doctor, but he was also an alcoholic and a drug addict, and I was always trying to get him to quit. And finally he got fed up listening to me and said, I can't quit because I accidentally killed a black woman when I was a teenager, and I've been punishing myself ever since because they didn't do anything, they didn't punish me for it. So I thought that was the story that I was going to find out. I thought that was what happened. What I found out almost immediately was that it never happened. And he went to his grave believing that he killed this woman. But it never happened, and I thoroughly investigated that. What I did discover was that a story my grandmother had told me right before she died. I had done an oral history with her, and at the end of it, I said, what is your most unforgettable memory? And she said, without thinking, the hanging. And I said, what was that about? And she said, well, there was a woman and some men who were hanged downtown, and I was told not to go, but everybody else was going, so I went, and I've never been able to get it out of my mind. Well, the way she told the story, I asked her a few more questions. She never mentioned race. So in the South, if one black person is involved in something, you're going to know it. They're not going to not mention that. So I figured it was white people she was talking about. And she said they'd been found guilty, so I figured it was a legal execution. And so I didn't push it. But that came back. And so when I was down asking questions about my father, I remembered this, and I asked my aunt about what that was, and she said, oh, that was a bunch of white men fighting over a colored woman. And I thought, well, that's something different. I'd never heard of that. So that set me off, and for the next 20 years, I'd be digging that out. And you're right, it was very taboo. I mean, the more I got into it, the more taboo it got. I mean, not only was it about my people killing people and getting away with it, it was about sex. Oh my God. And it was about a lot of sex and a lot of kinship, kinship, black-white kinship. And the youngest man who was lynched that night, January 22nd, 1912, a man named Johnny Moore, was kin to my family. And that led me into, once I discovered that led me into a whole network throughout this Harris County, Georgia, of black-white kinship, and not just from slavery days, but on up until the 40s and the 50s.
Ed, you found similar stories in your family too, though farther back, right? About kinship. I did, yeah. Across.
At the end of a 3-year investigation, I reached out to African American families whose ancestors we had enslaved. Dozens of families that I managed to find. And with their consent and participation, told the stories of some 10 African American families from slavery down to the present, alongside the story of my white family. And among those 10 families, there were 2 that I was able to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt were cousins of ours. And because of interracial sex on the plantations 150 years ago. And naturally, this is the sort of crux of the taboo that is the basis of segregation and if you like, white identity. So I told their stories, which in effect are our stories, and it was very disturbing for a lot of people in my white family, as you might imagine. It was very empowering, I think, for a lot of African Americans who heard about this story. I don't want to claim too much for it, but yeah. So this is true. I mean, we know this, that black folks and white folks have been sleeping together for centuries, and that our idea of racial separation is contrived by and large. So, but I think that the way to undo that idea is to try to bring above ground stories of people who shared their lives in their beds and gave us the rainbow country that we have today.
We're talking about confronting a Southern white past, but both of you, in your work, dealt in quite a bit of detail about the African Americans who were connected to your families. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the research. We're at the Brooklyn Historical Society, after all. And many of you may know, if you've done your own research, that African Americans often did not appear in the textbooks in years gone by, but they often don't appear in the records either. So it's not an easy bit of work. Can you talk a little bit about when you decided to try and tell the stories of the enslaved people on the plantation and on the folks who died in 1912?
Well, when I first started this, I couldn't find Hamilton, Georgia or Harris County, Georgia listed anywhere. I thought, it was just a place that time forgot, and I could quite understand why that would be the case. But as time went on, I began to find more and more information, and also about African Americans in and around Harris County. The first thing I did, which is what I always did as a reporter, was I went to the people. I spent a lot of time traipsing around the back roads of Harris County, Georgia, and traipsing through the jungles, because there were still jungles there, looking for old shacks that people were still living in, and cowering behind trees when they sent their dogs after me, and tripping over roots and vines, and just looking for anybody that looked old. And I found a lot of old people back in those woods, and they were so lonely and so isolated that they just couldn't wait to tell me their stories. And other reporter friends of mine had trained me and schooled me and how I should dance around and build up and work them up to it. They were just sitting there. It just rolled off their tongues. They were sitting there waiting to get these stories off their chests. And I really began to feel guilty, because often within several months they would die.
Right.
And, I wasn't sure that I wasn't causing that, but I'm quite sure, since most of them were in their 90s, that they would, they had just held on a little, just long enough to tell the story.
Did you have the names of the people who died, or when you were going?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I did have the names.
And where did you get the names? How did
Yes.
you come across them? In microfilm, or how did you find the names?
They were in the paper.
Okay.
They were reported, yeah. I was not able to find any of the descendants of any of the 4 victims of the lynching. And I tried, and I would visualize. I would be in all these archives all over the country. I went in archives, and I would see African Americans there, and I would think, maybe I should ask them if they're kin to Dusky Crutchfield. Maybe, because I was having so many coincidences that I thought it's conceivable that I maybe am sitting right next in the Library of Congress, right next to Dusky Crutchfield's great-great-granddaughter. That never happened. So I assumed that once the book was out, people would come forward.
Ed, how did you begin the work of trying to unearth the stories of the African Americans who were enslaved there?
Yeah. Well, I just have a memory of the first meeting I had with an African American family to whom we were related, and it went something like this. The name of the family was Harleston, and they lived in Atlanta. And the elder in that family was a woman named Edwina. So I drove to Atlanta. She'd agreed to see me. And fortunately, she had a very good sense of humor. And so I knocked on her door in Southwest Atlanta with some nervousness. And she throws open the door, and she's an 80-year-old, very poised lady, and she says, "Well, there you are." "We know all y'all's business." And she did.
And so did you have the names? How did you go about tracing forward?
Well, this was before the growth of Ancestry.com and before a billion records were digitized. And so I worked on paper. The Ball family were almost like Germans in their obsession with record keeping.
Oh, that's great.
And generation after generation, a horde of papers was passed down. And so about 1910, 1920, these papers went into public collections. And they'd been sitting there for 100 years. 10,000 pages of records. Lists of slaves, the purchase and sale of people, medical records of slaves, thousands of letters, maps and plats and properties records. And so I dove into this trove and began to construct family trees using the lists of enslaved people, which included births, deaths, children, partners, where they lived, their jobs, sometimes their illnesses, sometimes biographical details of other kinds. So I had constructed, not simply, but I had constructed family trees. And as if you do African American genealogy, you know that there is what they call a brick wall at the year 1865. So I had this very unusual situation, which is I had family trees of people in slavery from 1720 until 1865. And everyone is, in these records, is identified with a single name: Hannah, Tenna, George, Cuffy, Rebecca, Timbo. So I had this problem. How do I get into the era of freedom? As it turns out, The Ball plantations, many of them turned into sharecropping farms after the Civil War. Half of the enslaved people left, and half remained to work on the sharecrop farms in the same fields where they had worked in slavery. And these folks signed, with an X, contracts which identified them by first name and by surname, which they had chosen. They had chosen a surname: Simmons, Manigault, Rudolph, etc. So I matched my family trees from before 1865 with family trees made from the sharecrop contracts and proceeded from there. The very first person I found whose ancestors were enslaved by the Balls was not by this method. It was by an unusual coincidence. One of the few sets of documents that had not gone into public hands was a set of letters written by a formerly enslaved man named Peter Martin, to a great-grandfather of mine. Why did those letters stay in my family's hands? Because they were nostalgic. And they said something like this: "Dear Massa Ball, do you remember that bird dog named Bounce? Man, he was good. Dear Massa Ball, do you remember the 40 acres back behind the reservoir, which never produced?" And this was a man who'd grown up on a place called Limerick Plantation, side by side with my great-grandfather, Isaac Ball. And these letters were coming from him as an old man, and he's a preacher at this point, and he's writing his former enslaver to ask for clothing and money. "Well, Massa Ball," and this is 1920, "we're up here in Sumter County, and my children in the school don't have any coats. Would you send us some coats?" The story is spinning out. So I began to telephone families named Martin in the tiny towns from which these were postmarked, and suddenly, very quickly, I found the right Martin family. And I drove up from Charleston to visit them, and a man named Henry Martin answered the door, and he was a retired school principal, and he was a very soft-spoken man. And if that had not happened, if I had not found an almost a scholarly, understated comrade in Henry Martin, I would have been frightened off. And we sat like two students and studied these letters of his.
Did he know?
He knew this man who was his grandfather. He
Did he
not
know the Balls? No.
He knew about the Balls, yeah.
He did.
He knew about the Balls, yeah. From his grandfather. But he didn't know about these letters. Anyway, so that was, those are a couple of stories. I mean, there are a bunch of different stories like that. But the records were plentiful. That's
Yeah.
In terms of records, I found a wonderful collection of family letters and records similar to what he's talking about. My family in Georgia were not huge slave owners. The ones that owned slaves owned maybe 100 slaves, but there were other families connected to my family in North Carolina and Maryland who were very large slave owners, and they left those kinds of Germanic records of their existence. And in the North Carolina records, I learned the names of the kinfolk in North Carolina who I had never been told about. I was basically raised by my mother, who was from the sheriff's family, and they were poorer people. She told me they never had slaves. They did have slaves, but not that many. And she kind of poo-pooed the whole idea of people bragging about how many slaves they had. What I discovered was that there were some African Americans that became very famous in history that were related by blood to my family. And the way that I discovered this was that I had run across a quote that I wanted to use in my book by an African American woman named Anna Julia Cooper, who became known as the first black feminist in America. And Anna Julia Cooper was at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, I believe in 1893, was it? And she took white men to task there and talked about their sexual predations of black girls and women. And I thought this was such an unusual thing, such an astounding thing that an African-American woman would do this, that I wanted somehow to use this, but I didn't want to, at the time I was trying to tie everything as much as I could to that place, to Harris County, Georgia. And I thought there's no way I'm going to connect Anna Julia Cooper to Hamilton, Georgia. And then I did a little more research and discovered that in private papers, she had revealed that her father was a man named George Washington Haywood. And I knew from having gone through those Wilson Library at the University of North Carolina collections that George Washington Haywood was a cousin of mine. Therefore, Anna Julia Cooper was a cousin. And those kinds of things kept happening to me all the time. There was another guy named Alex Manley, who was African American, also from North Carolina, who was the editor and owner of the first daily African-American newspaper in the country in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I discovered that he also was a cousin. He was driven out of Wilmington during the so-called Wilmington riots, which I also discovered those same Haywood white cousins of mine had funded and led. So I went from thinking that I was writing about a county that time had forgot, that basically had never done anything to warrant any kind of historical notice, to finding things all over the place that connected to that place.
How did your families respond? And did you ever consider not publishing, or did people ask you not to? How did you deal with the concerns that people may have raised?
Well, this book I published 15 years ago, so it's not exactly fresh anymore. But when I came out with this book and people read it, and as I mentioned, there are about 150 of us in Charleston. Very few of the Balls left Charleston. It was like I'd thrown a dead possum on the dining room table. I became the radioactive person. It divided the family. Let's say that the people over age 50 were angry and very upset with me and shunned me. People between age 50 and 25 were nervous that this might hurt them socially. And people younger than 25 were like, I'm down with that, all right.
Can I ask you, Karen, in the And your book came out in January, so...
My book came out in January.
It's more recent.
I was working on it for a long time, so a lot of people knew. I didn't hide the fact that I was writing this book, and actually was surprised at the extent to which some of the older ones that I felt would be opposed to it, to the extent that they actually helped me, though I have to be honest and say they really didn't know what they were helping. So, they had some idea, but I didn't know. I mean, I kept finding things out all along the way. Mostly what they would say, my mother's generation would simply say, I hope I die before the book comes out. or I'm going to have to leave town. I won't be able to hold my head up in public. All those kinds of, they felt they were going to be shamed. Most of them did die. I didn't. It just took me that long. I didn't time it that way, and I had nothing to do with any of that. Hopefully, I'll never know.
You seem to have killed a lot of people off.
I've killed a lot of people off. It runs in the family.
I got to know your secrets
Oh,
there.
God.
We're going to take some questions, but before we do, I did want to ask about today, and have things changed? And also we're talking about Southerners, but I'm curious too, you both have spent time in the North. How do white Northerners, how do white Southerners grapple with the past? How are we doing, and are... No one wants to
How
jump
are
in.
we doing? Well,
Yeah,
I'm
and
doing
have you
just
seen-
fine, thank you. But I'm not so sure about the rest of you. I think we're in bad shape. I think we are in really bad shape in this country. I learned from my own research and all that long journey I took just how non-racist I wasn't. We whites have been so deeply programmed into white supremacy, into the notions, into the way of seeing everything through a white lens, a white frame. And most of us don't have a clue. I am heartened by what's going on in the country right now, especially among young people, the Black Lives Matter movement. My group is called Coming to the Table, which is a great organization that was founded by the black and white children of the founders. And it's a very exciting organization in which we are coming together with, whites are coming together with the descendants of people that their people enslaved. But we've got a long way to go, and I think obviously I am seeing things that with the police shootings especially that look exactly like Harris County, Georgia back at the turn of the 20th century. Look worse actually.
And Ed, you're diving into and have been working on another book about another ancestor, a Klansman, and so you are back into your family, back into this history again. Have things changed? I mean, in your families grappling with this, in the communities where you're doing your research?
Incrementally, yeah. The book Slaves in the Family, which I've been talking about, is set in South Carolina among my father's family, the Ball family. I'm working on a book now about a person in my mother's family in Louisiana who was active in the first generation of the Ku Klux Klan. And those two families in Louisiana and in Charleston don't have much to do with each other. But things are better, I think, in terms of storytelling. I think it's easier for black people to acknowledge and tell the stories of enslavement. I think it's better among some white people to acknowledge and tell some of the stories of Jim Crow. I think that we're in a curious and difficult spot right now. The civil rights movement is, 40 years behind us, and it was transformative. It transformed the legal system, and it was enormously painful and difficult. But I think we're going to find, in retrospect, that the transformation of the legal system and notions of public appropriateness and racial speech will be regarded as comparatively easy compared with the next stage, the one that we're entering now. And that is for us to do an exhumation, personal exhumation of our unconscious, the contents of our souls, one person at a time. It will be enormously difficult for us each to look in the mirror and do psychoanalysis on oneself, to pull out the strands of our identities as white people, let's say, and look at them. There was a very interesting moment in the presidential debate last night.
One.
When Lester Holt said, "Let's talk about race." And Hillary Clinton said something that I'd never heard before in national television, and that was, she said, "Well, we as white people have to become more aware of our identities as white people." Did you all notice that? It was very startling. Well, I think she's on to something, but this phase that I think and hope that we're entering is going to be, in retrospect, it's going to be much more difficult than the one that gave us sort of the legal machinery of equal rights.
Could I say one thing to that? I was thinking of this last night. One of the things that I became most painfully aware of in doing my story is that large numbers of white men killed other white men and black men and women and got away with it. Nobody was prosecuted, ever in that county. No white man ever went to jail for murder in that county up until at least the 50s. And I'm not even sure about that. They were obsessed with black criminality. They were projecting their own criminality onto blacks. And this is what I saw Donald Trump doing last night. He became most passionate when he talked about the bad guys in the hood. And we had been looking at all kinds of charges against him, criminal charges, felony investigations for which he's never paid anything. And so it's not Donald Trump doing the exact same thing that those rednecks in Harris County, Georgia were in 1912.
Hello, I'm Kimberly Jonz. I'm a history professor at OIU. This semester, past semesters, you see how old it is. But my mom met you, Karen. She's from Hamilton, Georgia. She met you when she was in Georgia, and I spent my summers there. And I was wondering, I'm doing my family history, but I can't get access past my great-great-grandmother, born in 1859. So what archives did you use when you were trying to put together the slave past?
I I use census forms for a lot of that kind of, I use later, I didn't have Ancestry in the beginning, but I have found Ancestry. You have to be careful with it, but it has the government documents. In the beginning, I was using the National Archives and going straight to the census forms. 1859 is, you can probably find her in the 1870 census.
I found her, but I found her by her married name. And I think she's a Hudson. Oh,
okay.
Related to the Hudson.
Well, let's talk about this later. We can get together on this. Okay.
Okay, right here.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to the speakers. One of the themes that came through tonight was the issue of racism, and not only racism, but foregrounding and backgrounding of voices. Particularly when we think about the records as the only symbolic representation of the lives of Black and African American people. And the fact that those records were written by white slave owners and slave holders. So the connection between Black Lives Matters is really close. And I saw a pattern emerge in the sense that once again, through your work, the voices of Black people are not coming necessarily through their own voices, but once again, through the voices of the descendants of masters and white. So that privilege was something that came through. And I was wondering if in your writing and in your journey through this book, you were able to confront the privilege of talking on behalf of other populations, and whether you were able to grapple with that as authors going through. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. I had two choices. I could either try to tell the stories of African Americans, or I could not. And I chose to do the former. In principle, another person might have written this book, Slaves in the Family, because all of the records which you rightly identify as the generative leavings of the family in power are public records. All of the plantation records of the Balls are in public hands. But I thought that there would be more power in the story if I attempted to involve myself personally with the memory of slavery. It's true that there is an ethical quandary in this kind of work. And I don't pretend to have solved it. The book that I wrote, to my surprise, earned money. And so I was faced with another ethical quandary, which is to say, I earned money from the stories of African Americans that I had told. So, one thing I did was to establish a foundation called the Committee of Descendants, in which I brought together members of my own family, the ones who had not shunned me, and members of some of the African American families who had gone with me on this journey, and $100,000 that I had earned, which is not a whole lot, but it's $100,000. And we began to give small grants to churches, to tutoring programs in South Carolina to students who needed a few $1,000s to go to college until that money was exhausted. So those are the beginnings of an answer to this ethical quandary of who can tell the story of black people and white people. I was certainly criticized by some African American intellectuals in the press for telling this story, effectively saying, who is he, the descendant of slaveholders, to tell the stories of enslaved people? It's a very good question. But I also found that African Americans who are not in the intellectual class, who are, let's say, family historians themselves, who are interested in, their own ancestry, I found over the years that a number of people kind of like the idea that there might be a path to investigating black family memory, and this is what it could look like. All right, so that's enough.
You described your book as 15 years old, and you described it as making money. I hope it's still making money. I use it. I'm a history teacher, and it has been a very big part of my curriculum for 15 years since it was published. And it is a revelation to all sorts of people, of all classes and all colors. And one of the most marvelous revelations in the bottom of it is the revelation of when you go back to Africa and discover that Africans owned slaves. And this is also closed book for an awful lot of people in this country. So thank you.
Thank you.
There's this in the orange, yeah.
Hi, my name is Linda. I've enjoyed listening to you. I'd like for you to, if you can, tell me a little bit about your family's relationship to the poor whites. Not every white person was a slave owner, and not every black person was a slave. So just tell us your family relationship to the poor whites and how, just give me, if you know.
I come from a very mixed family. My mother's side of the family was almost entirely poor white, with some variation. I would say the richest among my mother's family maybe owned 3 slaves, maybe 6 at most. But they worked in cotton mills. They were sharecroppers. They were, what I discovered about at least Harris County, Georgia, which is all I can speak to as far as the demographics, families, it was a complicated situation because many families had rich and poor within the family. There was a lot of mixture. And what happened in the South is that what formed the foundation of racism was the need of the 1% or the need of the upper middle class to divide poor whites from African Americans. And wherever they came together, and what I found was there were many times Reconstruction brought poor whites and blacks together in Harris County, Georgia in a big way. Populism in the 90s brought poor whites and blacks together in a big way. And each time that happened, there would be something that would tear them apart. That was not allowed to happen ever. And that's what was going on in 1912. There had developed a great deal of fluidity between poor whites and blacks. It was centered on the moonshine industry, which was the only way to make money in those days in a place like that. So they were in business together. They were loaning money to each other. They were involved in sexual relationships. Everybody. And that was becoming a very embarrassing and difficult and politically inconvenient thing for my father's side of the family, who were the 1%. And this lynching came about in order to send a message that this kind of dynamic had to stop.
Okay, point of information. I'm from the country part of North Carolina, just outside of Wilmington, North Carolina. And poor whites and poor blacks were able to, as you said, do things together. And my grandfather and my father told me some of the stories of the whole Manley situation. There was a vibrant black population in Wilmington that owned newspapers and stores and all kinds of areas. And then in my area, there were black farmers that owned land and farmed. And so I just wanted to point out that
Thank you.
it was just not slaves and
Right,
slave owners.
right.
There were people like my family and other
Exactly.
families that were in the middle.
Yeah.
I guess you couldn't call them middle class, but they didn't have to depend on the slave owners. And
Hi, Karen. I'd like to know something about your book that came out, and when you went back home to Georgia, if the people, I'd like you to share the story you were telling us in the Coming to the Table group, that the local people acknowledged about the lynching, and that the church or the library were going to acknowledge or apologize or something. And I wanted to know more about that because, as you know, Dion and I have an uncle who was lynched in Mississippi. And so we thought that if you got your people to acknowledge what they did, then maybe we could go to Mississippi and get, those people to acknowledge what they did to our uncle. I mean, it won't, solve everything, but
Right.
it would make us feel better
Yeah.
that they acknowledge what happened.
Well,
And
it
Karen,
helps.
So would you tell us a little bit about what happened?
And I think it's a great question. It may be one of our last questions, a great question, because she mentioned that she was unable to find descendants, but there's been a lot of interesting things that have happened since her book was published.
The book just keeps writing itself. I got about a dozen members of my family in Georgia to agree to come to a memorial, to hold with me a memorial service on January 22nd of this year, which is the 104th anniversary of the lynching. I decided it was time to have some kind of a service to recognize what happened. And I right away was delighted to discover that the mayor of the town, a white woman, wanted to have this. She thought it would make Hamilton look good. There had been some things that happened that made Hamilton look bad, And so she said, sure, I'll get my minister to hold it at the Methodist church. And I said, well, the Methodist church is perfect because that's where most of the mob, in that very building, most of the mob attended that church. So there couldn't be a more perfect place. It was all set, invitations were sent, flowers were ordered, candles were bought, and 2 days before, January 20th, I had a message on my machine from the preacher saying, Karen, I am so embarrassed, but I'm just not going to be able to have that service at my church because my congregation is really upset at that book you've written. And they say it's just full of lies, and there's no way that we should help you to sell that book. I tried calling him. He wouldn't return my calls. I said, okay, I'll go to the library. We'll see about the library. And Ada Demlow, who is one of my big heroes at the moment, the head librarian, had already been to hear me speak in Atlanta and had stocked up the library with the book. And she said, sure, we'll have it. She said, it can't be religious, but, we'll have a service. And people packed the hall. It was great. It was about half black, half white, and we talked about very taboo subjects in Hamilton, Georgia, the first time black people and white people had ever sat together in a room, and they were trying to figure out who was kin to who. And so that's what happened, and I wish you well, and yeah.
One more, maybe in the back. Wait, please.
Karen. Now I can put my sexy voice on. Anyway, Karen, I'm curious. Do you still see that ghost?
The ghost. Do you see her anymore?
The ghost.
And also, second question, second part, do you have a name for her?
Hazel. Don't ask me why. That's just what I call her. Someone asked me if she had come back, and I said she never left. She's just with me. She's my companion. I speculate in the book as to who she might be because there are at least 4 very powerful African American women I discovered on my journey that she could be.
Thank you.
Thank you.